At a black-tie charity gala watched by 300 of the city's most powerful people, a woman was slapped across the face by her husband's mistress, and her husband told her to apologize. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman hosting that gala had been waiting 14 years for exactly this moment. Hello, friends. Welcome to our story. If this is your first time here, you are in for something truly unforgettable tonight. Please take a moment to like this video, hit the subscribe button, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment right now and tell us where in the world you are watching from. Are you in Texas, Georgia, New York? Maybe you're in London, Toronto, Lagos, or Johannesburg. We love seeing where our family is tuning in from. Now settle in, because this one is going to hurt before it heals. Her name was Lorraine Ashford. Not a woman you would immediately notice at a party. She was the kind of quiet that people mistake for weakness, the kind of still that deep water has before it pulls you under. She was 51 years old, and she had spent 23 of those years being the invisible architecture behind a man who believed he had built himself. His name was Conrad Ashford, real estate developer, self-described visionary, the kind of man who wore his wealth the way some men wear cologne, too much and always walking into a room ahead of him. Conrad had inherited a mid-sized property management company from his father at 32, and under Lorraine's quiet financial restructuring, which she performed without title, without credit, and without complaint, he had turned that company into a regional empire worth somewhere north of $240 million. She had a degree in corporate finance. He had a personality. Together, they had made something real. But Conrad had long since forgotten the partnership and remembered only the throne. Lorraine had known about the affair for 11 months before that night. Not suspected. No. She had a way of moving through her own home that Conrad had stopped noticing. She was the furniture, he thought. She was the fixture. And fixtures don't eavesdrop. Fixtures don't read documents left open on a laptop. Fixtures don't quietly consult a forensic accountant named Dwight Osei, a man she had known since graduate school, a man who owed her more than one favor and who had agreed, with very little persuasion, to help her understand exactly what her husband had been doing with the money. What Dwight found was not what Lorraine had expected. She had expected infidelity. She had found something much older and much colder. Conrad had been quietly restructuring asset ownership inside the company for 7 years. Properties that Lorraine had co-signed for, that she had strategized the acquisition of, that she had personally negotiated refinancing terms on, those properties had been moved, through a series of holding companies and trust amendments, into entities that bore only Conrad's name. It wasn't illegal. It was elegant. It was the kind of thing that takes years to plan and seconds to miss if you are not looking for it. He was preparing to leave her. He had been preparing for a long time. The woman he was planning to leave her for was named Petra Vance. 34 years old, originally from somewhere out west, now living in a downtown condominium that Conrad had purchased through one of his holding companies and listed as a corporate short-term rental. Petra was not unintelligent. She was, in fact, quite sharp, the kind of sharp that is useful when someone powerful is guiding it. She had been seen at 2 of Conrad's industry dinners. She had attended his company's holiday party the previous December, introduced as a business development consultant. Lorraine had shaken her hand that night. She remembered the handshake. She remembered thinking the woman's grip was too firm, too deliberate, the way people grip things they are trying to claim. Lorraine said nothing. She smiled. She moved through that party like the elegant ghost she had trained herself to become. And she went home that night and called Dwight and told him it was time to accelerate their timeline. The Meridian Gala was an annual charity fundraiser hosted in support of children's literacy programs across the state. It was held every spring at the Bellevue Grand Hotel. 5-course dinner, live auction, open bar for the kind of people who drink expensive things slowly. Tickets were $3,000 per seat. Tables went for $25. The event was covered by 3 regional publications and 1 national lifestyle magazine. It was hosted, as it had been for the past 6 years, by a woman named Simone Carver. Simone and Lorraine had grown up 11 houses apart in a working-class neighborhood in eastern Ohio. They had been inseparable from age 8 through high school graduation, the kind of friends who finish each other's sentences and remember each other's worst moments and love each other anyway. Life had taken them in different directions. Simone had gone into event production, married well, married again better, and eventually built a reputation as one of the most respected philanthropic organizers on the Eastern Seaboard. They had stayed close in the way that real friends do, not constantly but completely. When Lorraine had called Simone 8 months ago, quietly on a Sunday afternoon, and explained what she had found, Simone had listened without interrupting for 40 minutes. Then she had said, very simply, "Tell me what you need." What Lorraine needed had taken 8 months to build, and the Meridian Gala was where she had decided to finish it. Conrad had no reason to be suspicious of the invitation. He attended the Meridian Gala every year. His company was one of its platinum sponsors. His name appeared on the program. He believed the gala existed in some meaningful way because of men like him, which was the precise kind of thinking that had made him so easy to outmaneuver. He arrived with Petra on his arm. This was, by every measurable standard, an extraordinary act of arrogance. He and Lorraine had not yet separated. He had not yet filed anything. To anyone watching, and many people were watching, Conrad Ashford had walked into a charity event attended by business peers, journalists, city council members, and his own wife, with another woman presented not as a colleague but as a companion. His hand was on the small of her back. They were laughing at something when they walked in. Lorraine was already seated at table 4. She had arrived early. She was wearing a deep charcoal gown, very little jewelry, her hair pulled back with the kind of simplicity that takes considerable effort to achieve. She looked calm in the way that someone looks calm when they have made peace with what is about to happen. She watched her husband walk in with Petra Vance and felt something she had not expected. Not anger, not heartbreak, not the cold fire of vindication. She felt something closer to grief. For the years. For the version of him she had once believed in. For the marriage that had not failed so much as it had been quietly dismantled while she was still living inside it. She picked up her water glass and took a sip and turned back to her conversation. The first hour of the evening was the cocktail reception. Lorraine circulated. She spoke with people she knew, accepted compliments on her gown, laughed at appropriate moments. She did not approach Conrad. She did not approach Petra. She watched Dwight, seated 2 tables over, give her the smallest nod. Everything was in place. It was Petra who came to her. This was not planned. Or rather, it was not part of Lorraine's plan. What happened was this. Lorraine was standing near the floral arrangement at the east end of the ballroom, speaking with a woman from the Literacy Foundation's board, when she felt a presence behind her. She turned, and there was Petra Vance, close enough that Lorraine could see the slight tension in her jaw, the deliberate construction of her expression. "You've been staring at us all evening," Petra said. Lorraine had not been staring, but she understood what this was. This was a woman who had been told she was winning, and who needed to confirm it by drawing blood from the person she was beating. "I don't believe we've been introduced properly," Lorraine said. "We don't need to be," Petra said. "Conrad and I are together. Whatever arrangement you think you have with him, it's over. You should know that." The woman from the board had gone very still. Several people nearby had stopped their own conversations. Sound has a way of narrowing in rooms like that when something dangerous is beginning. "I appreciate your candor," Lorraine said. That was when Petra slapped her. Not a film slap, not a glancing thing. A full, open-handed slap across Lorraine's right cheek that snapped her head slightly sideways and left the room in absolute silence for 3 full seconds. Then the room exploded in the quiet way that rooms full of composed people explode. Not in shouting, but in the sharp intake of breath, the immediate leaning toward neighbors, the rapid and horrified exchange of glances. Conrad appeared from somewhere behind Petra. His face was doing something complicated, the face of a man running several calculations simultaneously, none of them moral. He looked at Lorraine. He looked at Petra. He looked at the room full of witnesses. And then, with the confidence of a man who had spent decades believing his own narrative, he put his hand on Lorraine's arm and said, quietly but clearly enough for those nearest to hear, "You should apologize to her. You provoked this." Someone near table 7 made a sound. It was not a word. It was simply a sound. Lorraine turned and looked at her husband. She held his gaze for a long moment. The kind of moment that contains everything unsaid between two people across 2 decades. And then she said very quietly, "All right, Conrad," and she stepped back. If you are still watching at this point, go to the comments right now and type, "I'm still here." Because what happens in the next 10 minutes of this story is the reason we made it. Don't miss a second of this. What Conrad did not know, what he had no reason to suspect, was that Simone Carver had been watching from the side of the room since the moment Petra approached Lorraine. Simone had a cordless microphone in her hand. She was scheduled to introduce the live auction in approximately 4 minutes. She was the host of this event. She had final authority over everything that happened inside that ballroom, including what was said through the venue's sound system. She walked to the stage. The room, still buzzing with what it had just witnessed, shifted its attention as the gentle tap of a microphone brought the crowd to attention. "Good evening, everyone," Simone said. Her voice was warm and professional, the voice of someone entirely in control of her environment. "Before we move into our live auction, I want to take a moment, because something happened in this room just now that I feel a responsibility to address. This event exists to raise money for children who deserve better. It exists because people in this room believe in decency. And decency, I've always believed, begins with how we treat the people standing right next to us." She paused. The room was extraordinarily still. "I want to acknowledge Lorraine Ashford, who has been a quiet supporter of this foundation for 11 years, and who conducted herself with more grace tonight than most of us could manage. Lorraine, I see you." Applause broke out. Genuine, immediate, and pointed. Conrad's face had gone the color of old plaster. Simone continued, "I also want to make an announcement that I had planned to share later in the evening, but that I think is appropriate to share now." She smiled, unhurried. "The Meridian Foundation is pleased to announce a new endowment, the Ashford Family Literacy Endowment, made possible by a founding gift of $1.2 million from the Ashford Family Trust, administered by Lorraine Ashford, trustee. The applause was louder this time. Here's what Conrad did not know about the Ashford Family Trust. It had been established 12 years earlier, during a period when Conrad was overextended on 3 simultaneous acquisitions, and Lorraine had quietly suggested that they place a portion of their liquid assets into a protected trust structure to shield against potential creditor claims. Conrad had agreed without reading the full document. He rarely read full documents when Lorraine summarized them for him, which she had done for 2 decades, and had signed where she indicated. The trust's administrative trustee, the person with legal authority over its assets and decisions, was Lorraine. Conrad was listed as a beneficiary. There was a distinction, a significant one. The assets Conrad had spent 7 years migrating away from her reach, the properties, the rebranded holding companies, the elegant restructuring, did not touch the trust. The trust held $11 million in liquid assets and interests in 4 commercial properties that Lorraine had insisted years ago be held separately. At the time, Conrad had called it excessive caution. She had not argued with him. She had simply had Dwight review the language twice before signing. 11 months ago, when Lorraine understood what Conrad was building toward, she had visited her estate attorney. Not the firm Conrad used, but a woman named Patricia Allenda, who had been her personal attorney since before the marriage and who had drafted the original trust documents. Lorraine had initiated a quiet, legally unremarkable series of amendments to the trust. Nothing that required Conrad's signature. Nothing that triggered any notification. The trust was hers to administer. She administered it. The divorce filing had been prepared for 6 weeks. Lorraine had chosen not to file it yet because timing, as Dwight had reminded her more than once, was everything. You file after the public record is established. You file after the room has seen who he is. You file after the woman he chose as his weapon has used it in front of 300 witnesses, 2 of whom were journalists. The filing went in at 9:47 the following morning. Conrad's attorney called her attorney at noon. The call lasted 20 minutes. Her attorney, Patricia Allenda, took detailed notes and then called Lorraine and told her that Conrad's team had expressed a desire to resolve this quietly. Lorraine had expected that. What Conrad's team had not yet fully processed, what became clear over the following 3 weeks as both sides exchanged documentation, was the scope of what the trust held, the legitimacy of Lorraine's administrative authority over it, and the fact that the gift to the Meridian Foundation, which had been publicly announced before hundreds of witnesses and recorded in the Foundation's official minutes, had been made from trust assets before any divorce proceedings commenced. It was not subject to division. It was not reversible. It was simply gone, given publicly and permanently to children who needed books. And the 4 commercial properties held in the trust, which Conrad had assumed, incorrectly, were legacy assets of minimal consequence. 3 of them sat at the intersection of 2 planned transit corridors that the city had announced, 6 months prior, were moving forward with full funding. Lorraine had known about those corridors 18 months ago, through a civic planning committee she had quietly joined and that Conrad had not known she was on, because Conrad had stopped paying attention to what Lorraine did with her time several years before that. The properties had been appraised at the time of the trust amendment. They would be appraised again during discovery. The numbers would not be the same. The collapse, when it came, was not explosive. That is the nature of the intelligent kind of reckoning. It doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives like winter. Conrad's restructured holding companies were still his. The brand he had built was still his. But the liquidity was not what he had assumed, and the leverage he had expected to negotiate from did not materialize, and the attorney he had relied on for the restructuring had, it turned out, neglected to flag a clause in the original trust documents that would have made the entire strategy inadvisable. That attorney was no longer his attorney. Petra Vance had a civil matter pending against her, filed by the venue, for the incident at the Gala. Simone Carver had made it quite clear, through her foundation's legal counsel, that the organization intended to pursue the matter fully. Petra's attorney had contacted Conrad's attorney. Conrad's attorney had advised him this was not his problem to solve. Petra had disagreed. That disagreement was ongoing and, by all accounts, unpleasant. Conrad had reached out to Lorraine once, 3 weeks after the filing, through an intermediary. Not his attorney, but a mutual acquaintance, a man named Gerald who had always fancied himself a diplomat and who called Lorraine on a Thursday evening and said that Conrad wanted her to know he was sorry and that perhaps they could talk. Lorraine had listened politely to Gerald. She had thanked him for the call. She had told him that she wished Conrad well, that she bore him no active hostility, and that her attorney handled all communications regarding the divorce. She asked Gerald to pass along that message. Then she made herself a cup of tea and sat in the kitchen of the home she had already decided to keep. It was in her name, had been in her name since they purchased it, a decision made at closing that Conrad had waved off as a tax strategy. and she thought about how strange it is that we spend years building something we don't fully see until we are standing outside of it. She thought about the woman she had been at 28, sitting across a conference table from a young property developer who had needed someone to explain why his father's company was bleeding cash and how to stop it. She thought about how she had known, in the first 20 minutes, exactly what needed to be done. She thought about how she had done it. For years she had done it, and how completely she had disappeared into the doing of it until she barely recognized the absence of herself. She didn't feel victorious. That's the thing that people misunderstand about this kind of ending. There is no triumph in it. There is only the slow, steady work of reclaiming your own outline. Dwight had dinner with her the following Saturday. They sat at her kitchen table and went over the discovery documents and drank reasonable wine and talked about the transit corridor properties and what the new appraisals would likely show. At some point the conversation drifted, the way it does between people who have known each other long enough, and Dwight said, "You knew all of this was coming, years before it happened." Lorraine considered that. "I knew the kind of man he was choosing to become," she said. "I didn't know when. I just made sure that when it came, I wasn't standing where he expected me to be." Dwight raised his glass. 6 months after the gala, the divorce was finalized. The settlement reflected the reality of what each party actually controlled. A reality Conrad's team had spent 3 months trying to recalibrate and failing to. Lorraine retained the house, administrative authority over the trust and its assets, and a cash settlement that her attorney described, without elaboration, as fair. Conrad retained his holding companies, his brand, and a significantly smaller liquidity cushion than he had entered the marriage with. He also retained the lease on the condominium listed as a corporate short-term rental. Whether it remained a short-term rental after the settlement was a matter between him and the tenant. That was no longer Lorraine's concern. The Ashford Family Literacy Endowment held its first grant ceremony 4 months after the gala. Simone organized it as she organized everything, beautifully, precisely, with the kind of attention to detail that makes people feel seen. Lorraine sat in the 3rd row and watched children from 7 schools in the district receive book grants and educational stipends, and listened to a 9-year-old girl read a passage from a novel aloud into a microphone with the particular concentration of a child who has discovered that words can be a country you live inside. Lorraine thought that was the most valuable thing she had attended in years. At the reception afterward, a journalist from the regional lifestyle magazine approached her. The same magazine that had been at the gala. The woman was polite, professional, clearly wanting a quote. She asked Lorraine how it felt to establish the endowment, what had motivated her, whether the events of the spring had influenced her decision. Lorraine smiled. Not the careful smile, not the performance, but the real one. The one she had been slowly finding her way back to. "I've always believed," she said, "that the best thing you can do with the years you spent being invisible is use what you learned while no one was watching." The journalist wrote that down. It ran as the pull quote for the article. Simone saw it and sent Lorraine a text message that was just a single emoji. Lorraine sent one back. They made plans for dinner the following week. "Friends, we have reached the end of this story. And if this one stayed with you, if you felt something in the quiet strength of Lorraine, in the patience it takes to wait 14 years for the right moment and the right room, please leave us a comment below and tell us what you thought. Was the revenge too calm? Was it not enough? Or was it exactly what it needed to be?" We read every single comment. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Every week we bring you stories like this one. Stories about real human choices, real consequences, and the kind of truth that only reveals itself slowly. Hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and we will see you in the next story.